Yeah, so let's take something complex and turn it into simple. There's three things that a central pattern generator, or a GMP, a generalized movement pattern, has. The first one is that there is relatively invariable sequencing, which means a particular muscle will activate first, followed by another muscle, etc. So in each pattern of movement, that's the sequence that's there, and it doesn't change. Even with the subtle variations in movement, that's the sequence that occurs.
Yeah. So as you guys might even notice on the video here, Greg's been doing this with his hand. That's a generalized motor pattern, and he could actually add more speed to that, or he could add more amplitude to that, but it doesn't actually change the sequencing of the muscles, and it doesn't change the timing, which is about how long a muscle stays under contraction.
Yeah, that's our second component of a GMP or a CGP, is that there's relatively invariable timing. So a muscle will stay active for a particular time, followed by the second muscle in the sequence, which is our first point, and it will stay active for a particular period of time, and that may be 2/3 shorter or 4/10 faster or longer or something, etc. And then the third element is that there is a relatively invariable distribution of forces between each of these muscles, which means that if that muscle was to activate with a amplitude of 1, then the one that's following it may have an amplitude that's 40% greater. So it'll be a stronger contraction relative to that one, and the one following it could be only 70% of the first one.
Yep, correct.
And when you have to run that movement pattern against force, an external force, for example, the whole 1.4, 0.7 amplitudes up, so the ratios stay the same. So that relative force distribution is the same. So just summarize, our three components are
Sequencing,
yep,
timing,
yep,
and
force
relative
distribution.
force.
Yeah. Now, clinically, that's impossible to detect, and yet our industry has many times attempted to do so. Here's an example.
With an alarming lack of success.
It's horrible because it's not reliable, and it doesn't have validity. Now, I know there's lots of different types of validity.
And the biggest problem is that it's not transferable. In other words, even if we are good enough to detect this as clinicians, does that actually help the person motor learn? And we're going to argue no.
It doesn't.
And does that mean that when they get out to real life, which is random because you're using a controlled environment in the clinic, can they actually replicate the learnings? And the motor learning research clearly says no if you're trying to do it that way.
Let's look at an example. A person lays prone, and because you've read some research that says that the lumbar multifidus is a segmental stabilizer and it should be a primary activator before limb movement, right? We've seen large amounts of that research. So you get someone prone and you palpate their lumbar multifidus or their erector spinae. You should be able to get the depth. I'm digressing. You palpate the glute max and you palpate the hamstring, and you ask the person to perform hip extension. Theoretically, you should get a segmental proximal stabilization first, followed by a distal mobilization, which would include lumbar multifidus activating first. Because the glute max has got a little bit of SIJ stabilization, which is proximal, you probably should get that in concert with, and then hamstring should activate so hip extension with glute max. Now, if you palpate that, you've got to have some pretty wicked skills to be able to detect what goes first, how long after, and which one fires to the right amount.
And let's even assume that your skills are good enough.
Let's assume you can do that.
Let's just say you can do it. Okay, so for the sake of argument, you can. Is that useful for that person? What are you actually teaching them to do? You're teaching them to isolate how to extend their hip when they're in a prone position.
Yeah, which changes as soon as they move into a different position.
Exactly.
Part one. And two is you've put the horse before the cart in so much as, what if you make a clinical decision that says, that's out of sequence, and you know what, the timing's off, and so's the force distribution. Typically, our industry has said, let's jump to trying to get that person to activate the multifidus better, or not more, just at 30% of MVC. And so again, you've missed the problem. Is it, if you're accurate, if we've assumed, is that because if you've said that the timing's off and the sequence off and the force distribution is off, is that because they have an underlying pain, which is changing motor control, or they have a mobility restriction, which is affecting...
Which means they can't get into hip extension anyway.
They can't get to hip extension.
Can't get it.
And so they lumbar extend, which causes a massive erector spinae component, etc. So you've missed pain, you've missed a mobility restriction and an inputs problem, and you're measuring outputs using a faulty technique.
Yes.
So we have sequencing, timing, relative force distribution.
And remember, you actually have to be able to palpate and distinguish all three.
Correct.
And I've never seen anyone who can do that, despite being around some of the best palpators on earth.
Yeah. So we bring this up because motor control is complex, and it's been simplified down to 3 things, and even they are too complex to be able to clinically assess. So we changed that a few years back, and we said, do you know, how can you encapsulate what timing, sequencing, and force distribution looks like? Well, the way that you do that is you should know what a CPG looks like within a bandwidth of variation. So these CPGs will have a little bit of variation. Me picking this cup up could be slightly variable depending on which angle I come at.
So just explaining the acronym, CPG.
Central pattern generator.
Cool.
Okay.
Which
So
is the same as a GMP.
So there's some variation, but you should know that if that movement pattern goes outside that variation, we consider that to be beyond the realms of a normal CPG.
Yep.
Now that takes some training. Luckily, you don't have to reinvent that.
Yeah.
Some brilliant minds have mapped these things. Okay. Now that still requires you to make a call, and here's what it turns out. A CPG or a GMP that has appropriately minimum levels of competency of sequencing, timing, and force distribution, how does that look in 2 words?
Clean and easy.
Clean and easy. It's clean because the sequence flows. It's easy because there's not an excessive effort or loss of control that requires more effort. So you get this clean and easy. And so once that movement pattern falls outside the bandwidth of acceptable or a normal CPG, it changes from clean and easy to the opposite. Opposite of clean is dirty or
Dirty and difficult.
dirty and difficult. So movement can be viewed as being clean and easy or dirty and difficult, and we step in to correct when it becomes dirty and difficult.